So I'm on the way back from dropping my daughter off to daycare last week. And on came...
I got a feeling.
Now, I got a feeling too. Or rather, a few feelings. This song hadn't meant much to me in the past. But now, I felt like I was being transported back through a tunnel filled with all the emotions of a decade. Happiness, sadness, excitement, dread. Some of you might feel the same way, if not with this song, then another. We have all felt nostalgia at some point. The powerful, warm, and sentimental feeling where you yearn for a rosier time in your past. And it got me thinking, why do we feel nostalgia in the first place? And should we lean into it? Or stay away? This is Amna Heather, and you are listening to Tethered Minds. Just like the emotion itself, we don't really know how to feel about nostalgia. We see this confusion in movies all the time. Is it a negative emotion that stops us from progress?
That's nostalgia and a trap.
Or not?
Nostalgia's great, and we love nostalgia.
Could it even hold the key to unlocking our future?
I think nostalgia is a resource we use to help us figure things out.
You'll hear the answers soon. So get ready to be transported through time and space as we look into the warm and fuzzies of nostalgia, alongside the burning pain. Because, let's face it, sometimes nostalgia just plain hurts. And like the emotion itself, the word nostalgia has a bittersweet history. While it's associated with more positive emotions now, it was coined in a dark place.
The history of nostalgia is crazy. I mean, it's just it's pretty wild.
That's Clay Rutledge, the author of Nostalgia, a psychological resource, and the go-to expert on this confusing emotion.
So the term was coined in 1688.
And not long before, Europe had experienced one of its longest and most destructive wars, which lasted 30 years. For context, that's 7 times as long as World War I.
So you have soldiers, many of them conscripted, fighting wars in the plains of Europe. So they're separated from home. None of these things are great, right? And they're really longing for home. They're singing songs, they're telling stories, they're sharing experiences, but they were miserable.
Many of them were experiencing terrifying symptoms: cardiac arrest, loss of appetite, fever, and suicide. And people were desperate to understand what was happening.
And so what happened is the physicians at the time were trying to understand this form of depressive homesickness. And so they were like, aha, then this is what's going on. That this constant longing from home is making these people miserable.
And so they coined this condition nostalgia, from the Greek word nostos, which means to return, and algos, which means pain. Over the years, nostalgia continued to have a bad rep.
I mean, there were all sorts of wild explanations, things like demon possession, a lack of maturity, a desire to return to the womb. But well into the mid to late 20th century, there was this notion that nostalgia was bad.
The 20th century. That's when people started to question whether it's possible that nostalgia wasn't making them feel bad. But the people who were already struggling might naturally be turning to nostalgia as a way to make them feel better.
And so it was the distress that maybe was causing them to be nostalgic, not the nostalgia causing them to be distressed.
But the shift in thinking didn't come from scientists. It came from a pretty unexpected group of people who started to intentionally evoke nostalgia. Marketers. If you watched the Super Bowl this year, you might have seen T-Mobile's nostalgic ad.
Home internet from T-Mobile? Wait till you see.
If you're too young for this, that's John Travolta reimagining his 1970s musical hit from the movie Grease.
Tell me more, don't you worry about speed.
But it's not just music. There's something nostalgic about scents, too. Hasbro was so certain that the smell of Play-Doh evokes nostalgia that they decide to keep the scent all for themselves.
Yeah, and you know that smell that Play-Doh has. Of course you do, right?
Of course, everyone does. Well, apparently it's so familiar and so iconic, it's being trademarked. Hasbro secured the distinction on Friday.
Okay, is this something you see often?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that businesses who are, marketing products are very aware of the power of familiar scents and sights and sounds too. I mean, all sorts of sensory inputs. But yeah, clearly there's something really emotionally potent about smell.
Do you have any idea why?
One idea that's been circulated is the olfactory bulb.
The part of your brain that processes smell
is closely connected to the amygdala, where you form emotional kinds of memories. So there's something about regions of the brain that are connected to smell that really make powerful memories and more emotional memories.
The amygdala is the part of your brain that processes all sorts of emotions. If you've watched Inside Out, you can think of it like the little room in Riley's head where her emotions hang out.
We should cry.
Sadness, no!
We can't cry in front of other kids! Stop her!
Stop it, Sadness!
I can't help it, Joy. I'm entering a sadness spiral.
The smell center of your brain has VIP access to this room. So when a familiar scent hits, like Play-Doh, it might open a floodgate of emotions and memories from childhood. And marketers were some of the first people to realize the strong power of scents to tug on your nostalgic heartstrings.
But they didn't study why? Why do we care? And so that's when, the psychologists like me came in, we started really trying to understand, what is nostalgia doing for us?
Okay, so I actually want to rewind a little bit. As I understand, your journey into nostalgia started not with psychology, but with your fascination with time travel, right?
I don't know why. I like time travel movies.
Travel back in time.
I'm a time traveler. I've probably time traveled more than anyone else.
Time travel illegal throughout the universe.
It's fascinating to me that time is something that we can measure fairly precisely, increasingly precisely, right? But it's experienced so differently. Sometimes you're sitting there and it feels like the time's going really slow. Other times it feels like it's going fast. So I was just really interested in the psychology of time to begin with.
And while time speeds or slows, our brains are always ready to zoom into the future or rewind into the past.
It's just so cool to me that we can run all these simulations and they're really productive, right? If you're going for a job interview next week, what are you doing? You're running simulations. What if they ask this question? Well, you're preparing yourself. That's really, really cool. And as far as we know, distinctly human. But that intelligence comes at a price because it has the potential to generate a considerable amount of anxiety because we can fear what might happen in the future, most notably our mortality.
And so, Clay started to look into what exactly happens when people think about their fears for the future.
Well, one of the things that, I was thinking of is, we don't just go forwards in times. And so perhaps the same cognitive capacities that allow us to travel into the future and potentially generate anxiety with that also orient us towards the past as a way to manage that anxiety. And that's the first studies I started doing is I actually had people writing about death and other unpleasant topics about the future.
Not morbid at all.
Yeah, right? And then seeing if having them spend a few minutes also writing about nostalgic memory was comforting. And we found that it was.
So, making people nostalgic was helping them manage their anxieties about the future. But, do we do this on our own? Do we spontaneously seek nostalgia when we're anxious? Well, in 2020, COVID and surging fears about the future presented a real-life experiment to test that. Remember how music can stir nostalgic feelings?
I got a feeling.
One team combed through not just hundreds, but trillions of data points from the music streaming platform Spotify. And, drumroll please, the answer was a resounding yes. When anxiety mounts, we do retreat to the comforting arms of nostalgic music.
Shades of night are creeping
So that's pretty cool. But I think where it gets even cooler is if you think about how that connects to other things. Like when you feel sad or lonely or detached,
or otherwise cold emotions,
that triggers nostalgia, which also makes you feel happier and more connected, which, we might associate with the metaphor of feeling warm.
If you aren't already convinced that nostalgia is a superhero emotional shield, consider this. Could it be helping not only against cold, scary emotions, but also the physical cold? The iconic scene from An Affair to Remember hints at this.
Winter must be cold for those with no warm memories.
Well, it turns out if you put people in a colder room, that triggers, higher levels of nostalgia, which makes them feel...
Wait for it.
...warmer.
Wild, right? Maybe that's why the coldest months of the year host some of the most nostalgic holidays. To name a few: Christmas, Diwali, Hanukkah, New Year's, Thanksgiving, Kwanzaa, and St. Lucia's Day. Maybe part of their purpose is to give us some of that long-lasting warmth that comes from nostalgic memories.
So that was my thinking, was nostalgia is a psychological defense to help you counter negative psychological states, both in terms of your actual physical environment, but also your emotional or psychological environment. But then what we started discovering is nostalgia might be more than that.
But before we get into that, let's understand a bit more about what nostalgia is. And because this episode is about time travel, we're going back to 1818, to a small cabin in Pigeon Creek, Indiana, where a woman named Nancy Lincoln lay. She was so weak that she would have struggled to shift into a position from which she could appreciate the beautiful fall colors outside. Instead, she would have seen the rest of her 360 square foot unfinished cabin, an iron pot, and her worried 9-year-old son. This son was Abraham Lincoln. It was in this small cabin that Lincoln lost his beloved mother and was left under the care of his 11-year-old sister. It was where they both faced hardship over hardship. Well, before they moved, and Lincoln's new life led him to become one of America's most important historical figures. Like Abraham Lincoln, many of us have dark and painful periods of our lives. What's worse is that our brain tends to store negative memories with much more detail than our positive ones. That's one of the reasons people avoid thinking about their past.
You will find the only pen living in the past.
You would think that Lincoln would also want to avoid this traumatic, painful past. But 28 years later, he wrote a beautiful poem about his return to this cabin. My childhood's home I see again, and sadden with the view. And still, as memory crowds my brain, there's pleasure in it too. And wait, pleasure? What is that pleasure coming from exactly? Clay has found that this type of reflection isn't rare.
One of the things that we discovered was that in about 3/4 of nostalgic narratives, there's what we refer to as a redemptive sequence. And what I mean by that is people would be talking about something in that memory that makes them a little bit sad or gives them some sense of loss or disconnection. But then what we found is often that was overwhelmed by a subsequent sense of appreciation or gratitude or happiness.
So why does nostalgia feel so good, even when it shouldn't? See, it's not just your brain's emotion hub and memory center working.
Entering a sadness spiral.
There's a couple of other brain areas that you see too. For one, there's something called the ventral striatum. This part of the brain sometimes has a bad rep because it's responsible for that addictive hit from gambling and drugs.
Yes!
But it might explain why nostalgia feels so good. And then there's the medial prefrontal cortex. This is the big shot in your brain, responsible for decision-making and self-reflection. It's like the movie director behind the scenes, putting together clips from your life to make sense of your past and how it shaped you. But, plot twist, there's something else that activates these same brain areas. Regret. And that's why regret and nostalgia so often go hand in hand.
And, I have a memory like this where I had a very good friend. He actually had been battling cancer for a long time and had beat it. And, so we were really excited about that.
Clay remembers one day that his friend reached out.
At the time, he'd actually sent me a text saying, hey, you want to go get a beer? And, I was busy, I had things going on, and I saw him a lot. It wasn't like I thought anything was going to happen to him. And I didn't go. I kind of blew him off a little bit. And that was the last, communication I had with him.
The last communication before Clay found out that his friend had unexpectedly passed away.
And, it was very upsetting. I felt guilty. I felt like I can't believe I let just some stupid stuff I was trying to finish at work get in the way of just going and hanging out with a friend.
During this period of grief, Clay started to retreat to nostalgic memories of all the times he did hang out with his friend. And there were a lot of them.
I used nostalgia to learn something from it. I was like, those were meaningful memories. And it's a good reminder that you'd never know what's going to happen in life. And so the things that are really important to you, you have to privilege those over other things.
Regret is an important emotion that comes with its own set of lessons, but it's difficult to process. Nostalgia softens its blow by focusing on the meaning behind those memories. Maybe Clay couldn't get another opportunity to hang out with his friend, but he was able to refocus on what he might prioritize in the future.
Because it's not like a life review where we're 90 years old and we're looking back over our life. It's a life review that you can do at any point in time, whether you're 18 or 40 or 70, and you can look at what are the memories from your life that are really most important to you. And that can help you focus your attention on what to do in the future.
As one of my favorite nostalgic movies, Lion King, tells us,
oh yes, the past can hurt. But the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it.
But other than life lessons or comfort, there's a little more to why we love being nostalgic.
So if you give people the opportunity to spend a few minutes thinking about a nostalgic experience, the people in the nostalgic condition subsequently report a greater sense of what we call self-continuity, which means feeling like they have like a stable sense of self across time.
The world around us is constantly changing, and so is the world within us. Every 7 years, nearly all the atoms in our body are replaced. Our bodies are in a constant state of flux. It's a humbling thought, but it raises an even bigger question. Who are we, really? And nostalgia offers us a way to answer that. It breathes life into disconnected memories and allows us to build a personal identity.
I think there is something about stepping outside of the moment and seeing how things are connected. And that's inspiring.
Because ultimately, nostalgia is about our identity. It helps us define who we are, what we value, our sense of purpose, and where we belong. Life pulls us in all directions, but when we know who we are, we can navigate the world. We all have memories, but nostalgia is different. It's not just about remembering the past, but feeling it. That feeling can infuse all sorts of meaning and importance in those memories. After the break, we'll look at one of the most nostalgia-inspiring speeches of the last decade.
We will make America great again.
And what happens when the emotional allure of nostalgia is too strong. We're back, and we're talking to Dr. Anna Stefaniak, who takes nostalgia to a whole new level. Because it turns out, nostalgia isn't just about us. It's about our communities too.
So our identity is really comprised of two elements. Our personal identity, so our traits and our experiences and how we define ourselves as a person, but also our group identity. And here we're touching on one of the probably biggest theories in social psychology that tells us that one of the ways in which people define themselves is through the groups to which they belong. So because we have this aspect of our identity, the social identity, we can also feel emotions that are related to that.
Emotions. Like the collective joy you might have felt when your country won an Olympic medal. Yeah! Or your favorite team made it further than they ever had before.
And nostalgia is one of these sort of group level emotions that we may feel. And it essentially entails feeling sentimental longing for how our group used to be in the past.
If you're like me, when you hear longing for how our group used to be in the past, it might remind you of another popular nostalgic statement.
And we will make America great again.
Anna knows all about this.
And what we've witnessed with Donald Trump's and many other radical right-wing politicians' appeals to nostalgia is their attempt to create a vision of the past that excludes certain people, and then they promise to bring that past if voters support them, right?
Right. Okay, so you just mentioned other radical right-wing politicians when you talked about Trump. And, my immediate thought too was that there are a lot of other politicians who share some of Trump's nostalgic rhetoric. And, some examples would be like Boris Johnson, Erdogan, and Narendra Modi. And anecdotally, it seems like they lean a little conservative. So is there an actual link between nostalgia and political ideology, or does it just seem like that?
This is an excellent question, and it really touches upon the most important element of my recent research. Because nostalgia, by definition, seems like the type of emotion that would be more appealing to conservative participants, because conservatism entails positive evaluation of the past and willingness to preserve it, right? It just seems like a intuitively conservative emotion. So at least some of the research conducted on collective nostalgia shows that conservatives do report greater nostalgia.
I love the old days,
However, when you think about Barack Obama, for instance, very liberal politician, when he was trying to gain support for his immigration reform, he invoked the tradition of America as an immigrant country, right, that accepted all those people who maybe were persecuted in other lands, right?
We were strangers once too. And whether our forebears were strangers who crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Rio Grande, we are here only because this country welcomed them in.
So again, by Gardner's support for his reform, he was also referring to positively valued elements of America's past. Only he was selecting those that supported his agenda.
That's the country our parents and grandparents and generations before them built for us. That's the tradition we must uphold.
So, nostalgia on both ends of the political spectrum, but for different things. Is it possible that these could be entirely different types of nostalgia? Anna got together with her colleague Michael Wall and tried to answer that question.
We initially conceptualized two types of nostalgia. So nostalgia for a more open society of the past and nostalgia for a more homogeneous society of the past.
And the idea was that liberals would experience more openness nostalgia, and conservatives, who typically yearn for a more traditional society, would experience more homogeneity nostalgia.
And this is indeed what we found. So conservative participants scored higher on the measures of homogeneity nostalgia. Liberal participants scored higher on the measure of openness nostalgia. It's previous work showing that conservative participants are simply more nostalgic. Our work shows that that's not the case once you factor in the types of nostalgia that people may experience.
So depending on your political orientation, you might be more likely to feel nostalgic about an open, tolerant past, or more nostalgic for a more homogeneous past. But Anna, here's what boggles my mind. The way that politicians paint these rosy pictures of the past, it seems like they're living in totally different worlds, which gets me wondering, how much can we really trust these nostalgic memories? Like, are we dealing with a dash of reality, with a whole lot of imagination here, or what?
That's an excellent question. What we know from work on representations of history and also from the ways in which human memory works is that this is a creative process in a way. And this also means that in principle, nostalgic memories don't have to have a whole lot to do with reality, right? So they have a subjective element in which, say, people who are strongly identified with their national group tend to recall less events from the past that would put their group in a negative light.
You have some personal experience with this, right? In Poland. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I come from Poland, and one event that really sparked my interest in that area was the publication of the book Neighbors by Jan Tomasz Gross, who basically described an event from World War II in which Polish neighbors burned their Jewish neighbors.
This book was published in the year 2000.
And what happened in Poland at the time was a huge outcry of people basically denying that ever happened because they were unable to process that sort of information about their in-group. And to me, that was really interesting because we were dealing with what I thought was a field of historical facts, but some people were ready to deny that event even happening, despite all the evidence for that having actually been the case.
I couldn't find any currently living survivors from this massacre to talk to. I mean, it has been over 80 years and there were very few survivors to begin with. But I was able to get in touch with the granddaughter of one of the most vocal Polish Jewish survivors, Rabbi Yaakov Beka. Her name is Yael Levy, and here's some of our conversation.
My grandfather wrote a memorial book, what's called a Yisker book, to remember the town that was.
And in this book, he talked about the massacre that took place in his town in 1941. Can you talk a little bit about that?
From what I understand, that was when the Jews were rounded up into the town square and they cut off the rabbi's beard, stripped him naked, had him drag around a fallen Russian statue that was up.
Was your grandfather there at the time?
He left right before. He got literally on the last boat out. But he compiled the memoirs of the handful of survivors.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how the survivors made it out?
There were a few people hidden by a Polish Christian woman while the massacre was happening.
Wow.
They saw everything, they heard everything, they knew everything.
How did the Polish government and the Polish people respond to the testimonies that your grandfather shared?
The Polish government kept flip-flopping about, there was a point where they were honoring my grandfather for speaking out and letting people know about this. The consulate made a whole party for him and his family. He got an award. And then they flip-flopped and said, no, there was no Polish culpability. It's all a lie. The Nazis did it because it became a crime now. You're not even allowed to say in Poland, you can't say that the Poles were responsible for murdering their neighbors. It's the law.
As wild as it sounds, this law is a real thing.
Any suggestion that Poland was complicit in the Holocaust could land offenders in jail under a new law, which Polish lawmakers approved on Thursday.
This was a highly controversial bill, and for many people around the world, it was seen as an attempt by Poland at rewriting its history. It also happened to coincide with the increasing nostalgia for a vision of Polish heritage that was less diverse. Now, before Anna started researching nostalgia, she'd also been interested in Polish history and heritage herself.
So I was working with a nonprofit organization in Poland that teaches Polish youth about the historical presence of the Jewish minority in Poland.
And in true researcher fashion, Anna gave out questionnaires to the students before and after the program.
We included a measure of collective nostalgia for a more open intolerant society of the past and a collective nostalgia for a more homogeneous society of the past. And what we were able to show is that essentially participants became less nostalgic or less sentimental about times in their group's past when it was maybe more homogeneous, and became more nostalgic about times when Poland was more open to cultural and religious diversity.
So just learning about a multicultural history made people sentimental about an open, tolerant past. But it did more than just that.
So just engaging with a multicultural heritage changed how participants in the study felt about the history of their country. And in turn, these changes in nostalgia explained their attitudes towards Jewish people and towards ethnic diversity. And we also saw significant positive associations between nostalgia and willingness to become civically engaged in one's local community.
What we're taught about our history shapes our collective identity. And in turn, that identity shapes how we behave. So that history lesson you might have dozed off in might have actually had a bigger impact on your politics than you'd like to think. Nostalgia infuses the history we're taught with emotion, and that can inspire action.
For instance, in a series of studies that actually established collective nostalgia as a group-level emotion and started this whole line of research, the studies were published by Tim Wildschut and Konstantin Sedikides and their colleagues. They were able to show that when students were asked to recall a collective nostalgic memory, so a memory that makes them nostalgic that they experienced with other members of their group, then those nostalgic memories were associated with greater willingness to associate with other group members, greater support for the group, even greater willingness to punish a transgressor who was not treating another member of their in-group properly.
And this can be seen outside of psychology labs as well.
So I know that there is evidence showing that appeals for donations that use versus do not use group-based nostalgia tend to be more successful. So there are tangible benefits of nostalgia both at the individual and at the group level.
So we know that nostalgia can be a powerful driver for political action. But given that our memories aren't always accurate, I asked Anna how we could avoid falling for politicians who might try to play the nostalgia card on us.
So nostalgia arises when people perceive their present as being more negative than their past.
Right.
So if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling anxious, if the weather is bad, and in a host of other negative circumstances, people tend to use nostalgia to help alleviate those negative feelings. So maybe if we can improve people's situation in the present, then we should be able to also limit the appeal of radical right-wing politicians who may use that rhetoric.
Whether it's politicians on the left or the right, they know nostalgia hits us right in the feels. As we navigate the choppy waters of social upheaval, COVID, and climate change, many of us are using nostalgia as an anchor to steady our ships. From nostalgic speeches,
We were strangers once too,
to music that stirs old memories,
I got a feeling.
and products that evoke simpler times.
Whoa! Good play, Doug.
Nostalgia is in demand. Its magnetic pull is so strong that it can be used in all sorts of ways by all sorts of people. But the silver lining, we don't have to let others dictate what we feel nostalgic for. In Clay's highly awaited new book, he tells us how we can use nostalgia to patch up our hearts, get our creative juices flowing, and light the way when things get fuzzy. It's called Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. And you can find a link to pre-order it on our website. That's all for now. So unless you're jumping into another episode of Tethered Minds, now might be just the moment to queue up some of your nostalgic favorites. We'll see you next episode, where we dive into the world of touch, that fundamental human sense that might shape you in more ways than you imagine. We'll unravel its vital role in our growth, the profound consequences of its absence, the deep scars left by unwanted touch, and the incredible healing power of a simple, caring touch. And how you can bring that into your own life. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.